Let's start with a little show and tell here on Tanzman Lake. I'll give a little bit of the origin story because I do think it's funny. Our clients that are Brooklyn based, they had initially reached out and when we started talking to them and said that they already had a house in Narrowsburg that they were using as a rental. They had bought some land in this place, Parksville, New York, that was on an existing subdivision. Not much development had happened, but it looked like a really kind of special property despite the sort of ghost towny vibe of the whole thing. And initially, when we started talking to them about the project, it was really just going to be a house. And that's what it looked like after the first couple of early introduction calls that I had with them. Sometime between, I think, our second and third intro call, they watched that Queen movie where Rami Malek played Freddie Mercury. And in that movie, Queen goes off to a farm to record Bohemian Rhapsody. And then they came back and said, change of plans. We actually need to add a professional level recording studio to this because we've determined that we want to make a destination where people come and bands come and they both stay in the house and have this immersive experience in the woods. And then they record their album there. So that started to shift our thinking on what this was, what the scale of it would be, how it would sit in the landscape. And then we're off and running, that there'd be a studio piece, there'd be a house part. And I think that's probably a good segue into where Sean came into it.
All right, so we are in Parksville, New York, which is like central Sullivan County for the most part. For your reference, Livingston Manor is right here. This is 17, kind of cutting all the way through. And then the yellow dot we'll zoom in on, but this is the right in Parksville.
I would say somewhere, if you go back one, somewhere between the yellow dot and the Livingston Manor is where there is a Huts billboard as well.
Yeah, probably like right
There.
here.
Yeah, about there.
Yeah. So as we zoom in, you can see they're pretty accessible to 17, pretty accessible to Livingston Manor. The further we zoom in, here's Tanzman Road. And then this is actually part of a gated community. So there's a gate right here at the front. And basically, it's like a big subdivision. Some lots are built, some lots are not, but they surround themselves around this lake, which is called Tanzman Lake. A couple aerial views. So this is about just under a 6 acre lot, like a weird shape, especially with this little kind of nub here at the end. But overall, a lot of the properties are between like 5 and 7 acres for the most part. So it's fairly spread out throughout. So you can get a good sense of, so you would come up this road here. This ideally is where you would have the start of the driveway. And then they have pretty good amount of access to the lake on their property. Plus, they have an additional kind of overflow pond as well, which is a nice feature, which we haven't really done much with as of to date, but I think it's something that we could definitely work with in the future. One thing to note is not necessarily a steep lot per se, but I think because of the size, there's about 100-foot drop from basically the entrance to the lot all the way down to the lake. So this was definitely something in terms of site planning and strategies, excavation, groundwork costs, something that we really took into consideration. So just, yeah, a couple more views. You can see that little pond I was talking about here. So ultimately from here, we developed a couple different options. This one was called the compound, in which case we started to take one datum line and manipulate that, cut into the hill, build around it, and be really particular about how we're treating the land, how we're excavating it, and always having the views oriented towards the lake. So this one ultimately, like you come through, park, and walk through the property and look at different spots like this little pond I was talking about, going through this little nub and accessing the lake from this side. So just different ways to spread about the 6 acres and try to utilize as much as we possibly can. So another one that we started to look at was the circuit, in which case I forgot that we even looked at this, but originally we were looking at it as a main house and a studio as separate. So actually two completely different structures and still having it oriented towards the views with kind of a little bit of highlighting of the studio itself, more the gem, a little bit closer to the lake. So yeah, this was diving back into it. I totally forgot we even looked at this strategy, which is pretty cool.
I also forgot that we did this strategy.
So it's fun to dive into these. From here, we ultimately did a site visit with a kind of a bigger team. There was a lot of us here looking at everything. So a lot of these will just be site photos on one side and then a quick little diagram. But ultimately, each parcel has like its own silly name. This one was called the Plateau, which literally makes no sense at all. There's no plateau on the site. It's just a sloping hill. But as you come in, there is an entrance grove of trees, which is nice. And even when we went, I think it was like maybe in November or December of 2022, so about 2 years ago. And even with a lot of the tree leaves coming down, there is still a little bit of privacy here in the front, which is nice. And it does slope down. A simple diagram, it's hard to see in the video or in the photo, but it does drop off quite a bit from the road. So you really enter into the space. Rock gardens are spread throughout the property. Definitely a really nice feature. There is a neighbor somewhat nearby, but you'd have to be pretty close to even vaguely see it, but just something worth noting. A lot of stone walls throughout, same things, similar landscape features that are naturally existing. The pond, as I described. And this is interesting. The way you access the lake, it does slope down, slopes back up, and a little bit of a knoll here, and then drops back down into the lake. So a little bit of protective qualities about the site, which is interesting considering it's a lakefront property. And then lake access here. So here's that little kind of nub. We're walking along this side of the lake. So small part of the property, but I think it's something ultimately they want to build like a floating dock on in the future. So something nice to have. And then, of course, the lake itself is like the reason they bought the property. So from this, I think we identified two different locations. One we've considered a great location, which is closer to the main road, on the same playing field as some of the other structures in the area. Less groundwork costs, a little bit more flat, already has some cleared areas. So really trying to think about this from a groundwork perspective, but ultimately we landed on the ideal location, and we knew that this one was going to cost a little bit more because it's further down the lot. It's a lot more sloped. So I think just in terms of groundwork, this one had a lot more costs associated with it, but now you're getting closer to the site. You're actually further away from any of the other houses. So it just feels a lot more private. So I think ultimately this was a really good move. And from here, we just looked at the two strategies a little bit more in depth, trying to put some real dimensions to it, real setbacks, understanding where septic well can go, all of these things. So really started to dive into it and ultimately landed on this option, which just something to note. Look at where the studio is in this drawing. I'll reference that. So now that we know a lot about the site, we know where we're going to build, we know what the project's about, we know where the views are, jumping into the floor plans. And this was an interesting first attempt, but ultimately the left-hand side here, more or less, is the village hut standard at the box. A few simple changes that we were looking at here, and then attaching this professional recording studio to a double wall assembly, acoustical glass, acoustical curtain wall at the end here. So a fully different structure. But the big idea here is having a foyer, some type of like sound lock, as it was called throughout the project, to connect one to the main house and then two to the live room and to the control room. So this particular one we were looking at, everything was on the same floor, and having the control room and the live room being accessed through the foyer, and then basically an upstairs lounge, which they wanted to use as like an overflow bedroom, but mainly to have people sit up here, look down through this glass wall, and be able to just experience whoever is performing the music there. So here come very quick initial studies, what it could look like, which I think a lot of the elements stayed the same. But the biggest thing that we've realized, it actually on the site made more sense to have the studio on the left-hand side, just based on the topography, based on where we would be excavating, trying to minimize as much excavation as possible. It just made a lot of sense to have the studio on the left-hand side. And then eventually we looked at it dropping down a little bit. So here's a couple more 3D studies. Definitely still keeping that big glass wall as the big idea here. Views towards the lake, that was like the idea. And then from here we introduced, now that we have a schematic level of drawings, we introduced acoustical engineers, and there was a lot of things that needed to happen for this to work really appropriately. One of which was the height of the control room was 10'6", which ultimately, when looking at that, it made sense to create a basement versus an upper floor. So instead of going up, we actually went down. So we pushed the entire, and which is nice too, because this is a bigger structure as is. So pushing it down in the ground about 10, 11 feet just brought the scale of the entire building together, which I thought was like a really easy move, but ended up really helping out a lot of reasons. Here's a couple diagrams we did trying to highlight like how you would move through the main house and then into the live room, control room, and lounge space. And so this was a version that we ultimately ended up with where everything's on the same playing field here. So it just kind of feels very seamless as you walk through. And then with that 10'6" height, that was like a non-negotiable from an acoustical point of view. That kind of set sort of our excavation line at the base. So this is where we're at in terms of what the renderings look like with the client. So we got to this level of resolution. As you approach from the driveway, you can see this is the studio on the right-hand side of the image. Starts to get cut down versus pushed up another 10, 12 feet. And you can see how daunting that might look. So now everything has a similar appeal. And obviously the big idea is the live room with views of the water. This is like the idea. So the next kind of like 30 images or so, we're just going to sequentially look at what happened so this is starting from, I think it was November of 2023 or June of 2023. We started to do some site work, excavation, groundwork prep, started to lay out some driveways, and then eventually get into footings, started to do framework for the walls. You can start to see how big the house really is. So something to note, a lot of the projects we work on are maybe 1,200 to 1,800 square feet. This altogether in terms of conditioned space is 4,500 square feet. So quite a bit larger, but I think the simplicity of the forms still remain the same. So I think that's something that we try to really carry throughout. Some more form work, and now starting to see the formwork come alive, steels coming alive. So this is as if you're standing in the live room looking towards the lake. So yeah, we have some steel moment frames starting to get erected. And then from here, starting to build the floor framing. So now things are starting to come alive here. This was in probably June of this year. So just a little bit of reference. I think the steel we erected in March and then started to get into floor framing probably around like May, June. So we're starting to lay some of the framework here. And something that was interesting is there's actually like 4 different levels of this project. These stairs lead up to a half level of guest suites. You can start to see the gable end framing on the one end. Exterior wall starting to get framed. The studio is starting to get framed all with LSM wood, which is to keep obviously straightness throughout. Roof framing starting to come in. And then this is all the roof trusses over at the live room. So this was quite a feat to get this. This is a 25-foot span, 35-foot height space. Starting to get some zip sheathing on, roof sheathing, the high temp ice and water shield up on the roof. And then now starting to add in some windows. And we even started to look at a couple different mock-ups of the way hemlock is being cut and how that's treated with stain. Ultimately, the clients decided to go with this more rough look, which to date, this I think is still on it. And this one looks so weathered and so beat up. This one doesn't. So just the different cut of the wood kind of played a really big difference in terms of maintenance. And then just a couple like small little details. This is a zoom in look of the live room gable end. So where we have a big glass wall here, just starting to look at how we're framing that out, adding an insulation. So really starting to get into the weeds here, starting to close that up. And then yes, some kind of where we're at today is a lot of miscellaneous interior framing, electrical rough-ins, plumbing rough-ins, bigger project. Schedule is just a little bit longer than a lot of our other projects, but overall, yeah, making some real big progress. I think ultimately by the end of this year, the goal is to have 90 to 100% of the main house completed. And then there would still probably be another couple months of work on interiors for the live room, control room, lounge, finishes, stuff like that. This was the standing seam metal roof looks amazing. You can see the height differences here between guest room and then the primary room. So yeah, really starting to come alive. This is definitely something I think is very key to this particular client. I think there was a lot of kind of going back and forth between what the project should be about, what costs should be, how we're moving through the process. And this is a diagram that we always talk about in terms of an emotional journey. But ultimately, we are here, which is exciting. Through all the trials, tribulations, 2 years later, we're at the point now where I think we're developed a really good relationship with the clients, the contractor, and overall, it's been such a fun ride. So yeah, that's Tanzman Lake.
Yeah. What percentage of the square footage is from the studio? It's more than half, isn't it?
It's probably, because now with the theater, I would say it's without the theater, it's probably half, if not a little bit more.
The theater being the basement space that we cooked up.
Yep, just capture that space.
Who's been here? Spencer, have you been here?
I have, yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite. It's so cool and a really special setting.
This one worth going to. I haven't seen the roofing before, but it looks amazing. It really does look good.
Yeah.
I haven't been there since our first site visit.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Oh, it's very different. Yeah.
It's just amazing to see how it all came together. And we worked in such a fast track like timeline with this one and designing and documenting and moving forward really quickly and solving problems along the way. It's a really good example of like where people can come to us with really ambitious ideas, and we've got the standards, and we'll go through the process to figure it all out in short order too. It seems like it's just amazing how fast it's going.
We should plan like an upstate trip soonish.
Yeah.
At some point for everybody. I think it's been a while since some of you have even been to anything. A lot of things like nearing completion. I think it's a good timing.
Yeah, I agree. Is this all backfilled now? Is that what I'm seeing?
Partially. There's some areas that's actually like the natural grade.
Oh, is it?
Some areas have been backfilled, most have not. There's still a lot of backfilling that needs to happen and a lot of fill to be added in the front portion, but there's a lot of fill on site already that I think we can just start moving earth around.
Yeah, looking great. Cool. What's the timeline for the facade for the studio?
Like the glass?
Yeah.
That'll be almost last, just based on when it was ordered and when it will be on site. That's a whole thing. The lead time is so much longer than originally anticipated. So now that things are starting to get colder this time of year, Terrence is basically going to board it up, because then eventually mechanical systems are going in and things are starting to get, half of it's going to be conditioned, half of it's not. So that's a schedule thing that we're working through. But yeah, we'll be one of the last items.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the considerations that were made for just an acoustically separated space?
Yeah, this is an older floor plan, but it's still pretty similar to what we have. So right in this space here, this is the live room. So this is double height space. This is where all the controlling would happen. And then just behind it is the control room. So this has a double wall assembly, completely separate. Even the glass is site built and has specific type of neoprene surround, but ultimately all of these walls are completely separate from wall, ceiling, and floor. So there's also separation clips for all the drywall that eventually is going to get put on. I think it was like a $40,000 or $50,000 line item just for these isolation clips, to give you a sense of scale of how many things need to happen for all of drywall not to be touching wood directly and wood touching other pieces of wood. So all of these were conditions that we worked with the acoustical engineer on. And it was an interesting relationship because they're coming at it from a commercial perspective. And obviously this is residential. It has commercial level qualities, but there are aspects of a recording studio that could easily triple, quadruple the price of this project, just purely based on like how construction comes together. One of which was a double glazed exterior wall with 2 moment frames. So that was something that was considered originally, but it was just astronomically more expensive than what we actually needed. So there was some VE items that we worked with the engineers on to make it so that it's not fully a professional quality studio, but rather it's something that people could still come here, get a really good recording quality to it without having to spend an absurd amount of money for that to work. So a little bit of push and pull between getting these details right and matching that with the overall budget. So yeah, that took quite a bit of time, but yeah, pretty happy with where things ended up. And then on the inside, there's going to be a lot of interior kind of felt materials, both in the ceiling and in the walls, that have certain absorptive qualities that basically help with echo, reverberation, and kind of all those things, which is nice. And that's something that the clients have been working with an acoustical material company. It's called Turf. That's a company that normally does only commercial products, but because of the scale of this project, they wanted to work with us, and pricing seemed right. Style seemed amazing. So I think overall, it's going to be a really nice aspect of the design of these spaces. It enhances it quite a bit.
Cool. And what's happening currently on the main house? It's not closed in on, there isn't drywall up yet.
No, we're still in the rough in phase. Yeah, so Terrence is pretty far along on mechanical, electrical, plumbing rough-ins. And then Spencer has been helping out a lot with interior procurement. The client's been doing a lot of interiors procurement. So a lot of the stuff's like on site already in terms of like tile and things of that nature. Even a lot of the plumbing fixtures. So everything's there, ready to go. So that's going to be like the next sort of big push for Terrence and his crew.
Cool.
And it's been interesting because I think most clients are in the camp of trying to spend as little money as possible. And this was a project where I think there was a little bit of sticker shock, and we did some initial pretty big value engineering, saved several $100,000 up front. But then now moving through the project and the process and discovering things and being like, oh, actually, maybe we should add another 2 windows on this one side, or maybe it should be a flat ceiling in this location, or maybe we should extend the deck, which we ended up doing here. So there was a lot of like little things that I think ultimately are just making the space better, but it's through the process. And I think through being there on site with the contractor and with the clients, we're able to make these types of decisions pretty quickly, knowing that they're willing to spend the money on the things that matter to them, which was nice. I think all the money that we saved on VE, we're probably putting right back in it, but on other ways to make the project a little bit better. So that was a kind of an interesting experience that is, I feel like it's not that typical of clients.
When is it going to be done? Does Terrence have a timeline?
Yeah, the goal is realistically to have the house buttoned up by the end of this year, if not the first couple weeks of January, like basically this line over. And then everything in the live room, control room, and lounge area would probably be another 2 to maybe 3 months. So looking at a spring CFO.
Awesome. So they're going to start renting it out in summer, spring 2020.
Probably. Yeah. And it was cool because I think getting on site with the clients, it was a nice experience where we were going through it. And yeah, we go through these drawings all the time and these types of presentations. And for us, I think we're able to interpret it pretty quickly. But for a lot of our clients, they have no idea what they're looking at until they get to site and they actually see things and walk through things. I think it was those site visits that they realized like how amazing and special this project really is. So they almost were at the point where they're like, we might not even rent it. It might just, the one idea was making this into an art gallery. And they're like, we might just make it an art gallery and just do that. So that was thrown around at one point, but no, they know a lot of people in the industry that I think could ultimately make this a really successful 1 project, but 2, just recording studio business in and of its own.
Cool.
Great. Cool. I think we did show and tell. Thank you, Sean.
Mm-hmm.